A Labour landslide, a Conservative meltdown, a Liberal Democrat revival. Welcome to the latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just a bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
So, guys, an absolutely historic result. The Labour Party got its supermajority, is now going to be in power for 50 years without any challenge or problem whatsoever, as we were warned by Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives during the campaign. Listen, before we get into the detail of this incredible Labour victory, and it was incredible, I know for some time now the polls have been predicting it, but when you look at where Labour was when Keir Starmer took over the party, worst result since 1935, deficit of 80 seats. I think that he'd have settled for a hung parliament at this election, never mind the majority that he's happened to secure. But I want to start by asking you where you were on the night as all these results were coming in. So, Joe, where did you find yourself as Thursday unfolded?
I was on air. I was broadcasting on Hereford and Worcester Radio in the studio with Trevor Owens all through the night. Interesting results there in that patch, which started off at 10 o'clock, with 8 Tory constituencies and ended up with only 5, 2 going to Labour and 1 to the Greens in an amazing turnaround. And I've been broadcasting pretty much non-stop. So yeah, you have to sort of control your glee at some of the results and sound terribly unbiased, as Jim knows. Yes, yeah. And what about you, Kevin?
Well, I was at home because I'm a saddo and I like to be able to concentrate on what is going on. I went from going out to vote in the evening, came home, watched the end of the Murray game and the tributes to him. I went through that emotional roller coaster because that was very well done, I have to say. But we'll deal with that on the tennis podcast. And then set up my several screens, allowed my children to stay up. They stayed up with me to watch the first hour, along with my partner, watch the first hour of it. I might have whooped and hollered a bit.
Yes, it was, great to watch. It unfold on the television. I watched the television. This is how sad I am. I recorded all the television programmes for reasons I will explain in a moment and watched them back yesterday. Jim, what about yourself?
A bit like Kevin, I watched the Murray tribute at Wimbledon, and then I watched the first couple of hours with my family, with my eldest son and my wife. But I had to go to bed early because I had these wretched tickets for Wimbledon on Friday, so I had to get
Oh, Jim, our heart bleeds for you.
Yeah, I know, and so I had to head off for London, where it was drenchingly wet yesterday. But I can beat you, Frank. I have recorded the programs on 3 different recordings. And I haven't even begun to watch them back yet. And the reason for this is that ultimately I'll be committing possibly to VHS tape. For technical reasons, because I've got the recordings of every general election results program since about 1959, and they're absolutely fascinating, not just in terms of the political changes, but of course the style of journalism. I mean, the early ones have masses of men with sort of ladies bringing in sheets of paper to these men who are smoking cigars and pipes and whatever. Anyway, sorry, I digress. So that's what I was doing.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we, as you will know, had our City of Liverpool Business Awards evening. And so it was a really busy night for us. We had the result, the exit poll, streamed live into the event. And it was quite interesting, the reaction, actually, because you had over 200 business leaders. We host these awards at this wonderful place called the Sefton Park Farmhouse. It's like a giant greenhouse in the middle of a park in Liverpool. Stunning venue. And as the results come in, a spontaneous round of applause broke out. Now, okay, it was a Liverpool audience, but I know those guys in there pretty well. And I would say that if some of them are dyed-in-the-wool Tories, then they've certainly voted in that way in the past. And yet, I think there was just such a desire to see this lot kicked out and a change. And we'll come back to that word as well, I think, during the course of our conversation. So, spontaneous round of applause. We then had to present the awards. My phone was buzzing like Billy O, as you can imagine. But I'm presenting awards and people are coming up and so on. And then a big shout out to Conor O'Donovan, who's the owner of the Sefton Park Hotel, which is about 5 minutes away from the Palm House. He allowed about 70 of us to all pile in to his hotel afterwards and watch the results as they were coming in. So we ended up in the hotel in the residence bar until about 5 o'clock in the morning. And then I came home and watched the sort of the commentary, fell asleep on the couch in my tux, woken up by Victoria as she got off to her PT gym session at 7 o'clock in the morning, as it is her wont. So a great night for anybody who supported the Labour Party, not a particularly good evening for the Conservatives, of course. But let's start with Keir Starmer and Labour, because, as I say, anybody who would have suggested 5 years ago that we were having here today a Labour government meeting to Cabinet this morning, you'd have been told that you were crackers, wouldn't you, Kevin?
Absolutely. What he has done to turn around from, as you said at the opening, an 80-seat gap to Boris Johnson's Tories to now having this almost Blair-esque landslide victory is quite incredible. But I'm sure we'll get into this, but it is slightly annoying. And I think even the beloved John Curtis, I think, is slightly leaving a gap when he talks about the fact that there's sort of no love for Starmer, and this really is all about a Tory loss. And of course, that is absolutely true, just as you were saying about the reaction in that room in Liverpool. But what the Labour Party has done, and to be fair, what the Lib Dems have done, and to be fair, what Reform has done, is to work the system. We have an electoral system in this country, which I oppose strongly, but it is the electoral system, at least for the time being. And what Labour did was to utilise that, to target their resources, and I saw that sort of close up, and targeted their resources, went for the seats that they could win, made sure they could defend the ones that they wanted to defend, and that strategy paid off. And, why interrupt an enemy when they're in the middle of their battle, when that's only going to be to your advantage if you let them get on with it? And that's effectively what happened during the campaign. There's a debate to be had about the big debates this country needs and the big decisions needed. But I think people are slightly damning Keir Starmer's success on the basis that the sort of Tories gave it up rather than he won it. No, what they did is they played the system well and they ran a very, very disciplined campaign.
Yeah, I
couldn't agree more, Kev. Yeah. Sorry, Joe.
Well, I think that's absolutely true, everything Kevin says. And I think there will be discussions and conversations about the fact that, as we all know, the first past the post system is not fair. And, it is quite true, factually correct to say that, Keir Starmer with a landslide is there with not the huge majority of the public who voted for it, but what it has done by people playing the system, and I think this is where it becomes interesting, it has cut some of those walloping majorities of over 20,000, 25,000 down to, in some cases, less than 1,000, and in some cases down to about sort of 5,000 or 6,000, which means that, going into the next election, there will be more marginal seats. There will be much more to play for, and tactical voting, which we've seen in this election and in the local elections in May. I think, in the end, the general public, who are quite smart and savvy about how to use their votes, will turn the system on its head, and we might get to a point where we do end up with PR. But I don't think that's the most important thing in Keir Starmer's intro at the moment.
Jim?
Well, let me disagree. Let's have a debate about this. Let me offer the opinion that it is astonishing how this voting system has delivered a massive Labour government with such a poor, what's it down to now, about 33%, 34% share?
34%, yeah.
So I'm going to say that Sir Keir conducted a very, very careful campaign, but that didn't enthuse the left of his party, didn't catch the imagination of the British people. And what actually happened was that the disgust with the Conservatives was monumental. I mean, I've seen so many interviews in safe Tory seats where you clearly they were interviewing quite a lot of elderly, it has to be said, elderly people who had for a lifetime had voted Conservative, who just couldn't support them this time. And I will suggest that that's what's happened, and that Boris Johnson sadly is right in today's Mail, where he says the victory is wide, but it is thin. Now, Labour can, by getting on with things and improving public services and all that, deepen that at the next general election. But let's just have a discussion about that this is a strange result. And then I'll get this in before we go any further, Joe. I hope we won't hear the Liberal Democrats complaining about the voting system anymore, because as I understand it, the percentage of vote is almost equal the number of seats.
I know. I think there's another one in Scotland that hasn't yet been declared, which was SNP, which is expected to go to Lib Dem. So, no, absolutely, first past the post, it's the best system. We've always said that, Jim, you know that.
I think that I personally think that Jo hit the nail on the head when she said the voters have become far more sophisticated in the way that they play the voting system. And actually 35% of a poll, when you have a multi-party competition, as we did this time in a genuine way, I think for the first time, actually, strong Green Party reform coming through, Liberal Democrats targeting their resources, as Kevin has said, in a very effective way. I think 35% so is more than respectable. And although I hear people telling me that first past the post is not the most fair system of voting, I've yet to see a system of voting that actually people can all get 100% behind. There's always something wrong with whatever electoral system is adopted. And I think that people like Best for Britain, of course, declare an interest. I'm on the board with the work they've done around telling people where they should cast their vote if they did want to see change, where the marginal seats were. I think in terms of the wider picture, Joe, you're absolutely right. What this peculiar electoral system has delivered is, yes, a big Labour majority, which will enable the government to get on and do things, but equally a warning. We've given you small majorities. So if you don't get the business done, then in 5 years' time, I mentioned facetiously earlier this idea that, stop Labour getting a super majority, they'll be in for a generation. In 5 years' time, and what we do know now about the electorate is that they've no loyalty to anyone. No, they are going to vote for where they think or who they think is going to do the best job. So I think that, warts and all, I think that our democratic system is a decent one. I think Keir Starmer should be proud of what he's achieved, given the challenges he faced. And we were all at stages during the last 6 weeks uninspired and screaming at times for them to get a bit more ambitious, a bit bolder. Jim, you said, they didn't play to the young and the left-wing vote. Well, Keir Starmer's waking up this morning in number 10 Downing Street. And he will say, Kevin, won't he? That strategy worked. It was right. And if we want to be bold in government, that's fine. And that's what I want to do. I want to deliver now as Prime Minister.
Yeah, I'd say two things to that. Slightly picking on Jim's point, stirring the pot, as Jim normally does. The first thing is, I think Starmer's analysis is right. That even if he was the greatest orator in the world, which clearly he's not, it would have been almost impossible, given what has gone on in the previous years, not least the nonsense of Boris Johnson. It would have been impossible to try and mount a campaign which was all about, green hills and sunny uplands and all the rest of it, with great debates about, the size of the state and massive tax reform and big things on climate or artificial intelligence and all the rest of it. That's the kind of campaign probably most of us would have liked to have seen or indeed been part of. But the atmosphere the atmospherics of this country were not right for that at this time. We've had too much of it. I think that would have been impossible to achieve and for people to vote for that, even if Starmer was good at that sort of stuff, which clearly is not. And secondly, picking up positively on your point, Jim, I think is that action. I mean, I thought his speech at number 10 was one of the best speeches I've seen him do. I'd like him to not look at his notes so much, but anyway, let's put that to one side. I'm getting slightly Faragist in my comments there. But I thought it was one of his best speeches. And one of the things he said in there was, we know that, people are exhausted, etc. And we know any action is going to do the business now. No, words are not going to cut it with you all, members of the electorate. It's going to be action. And I think through actions, and some quick actions as well as medium to long-term actions, that's what's going to change things and change the atmospherics and actually perhaps give him a deeper, greater depth to his kind of electoral backing, as it were, almost after the election rather than before it. And I also think he will become a little bit more relaxed and comfortable in the role. I think as a number of commentators have said, I think he's cut out for governing. He wasn't really cut out for opposition, albeit a landslide victory.
Yeah, maybe Rishi Sunak proved that he'd have been a better leader of the opposition. Some of the performances he put in during the election campaign. Let's move on then to the government and what Keir Starmer has done since that election on Thursday evening, Friday morning. Joe, he's appointed as cabinet. Any standouts in there for you? Any interesting moves that he's made?
Well, he's kept, and very wisely, he's kept what was his shadow cabinet. Rachel Reeves, who becomes the country's first ever female chancellor, I think, hugely respected in the economic and business world and the banking world. She's got fantastic credentials and she will be great. Yvette Cooper as Home Secretary, had served in Gordon Brown government. She's been around for a long time, will be good. The thing that they bring, even though they've been in opposition for 14 years, they bring experience, they bring knowledge. And as we've said before, they've done the hard yards in opposition. They haven't jumped ship and gone off to do some lucrative non-executive thing like so many of their colleagues across the benches have done in the past. So he's got a good steady team. He's got David Lammy as Foreign Secretary. And there were rumours before the election that Douglas Alexander, who was re-elected, would take that position. I think that would have sent out a very, very bad message. And there will no doubt be a role for Douglas Alexander at some point, Ed Miliband to Environment. And these non-elected appointments, James Timpson from Timpson's the Shoemakers and Pea Cutters, who goes to Justice, he goes to the Lords, but will become a Justice Minister, not sitting at Cabinet. And Sir Patrick Vallance, who everybody will know from all those COVID press conferences, who becomes Science Minister. And I think those are two very bold moves that send a message that, yep, we want people who've got the skills to get the work done. We're in a hurry, but we're not rushing, but we know how urgent everything is. I mean, Alistair Campbell was speaking this morning, who, as everybody knows, was Tony Blair's head of comms. And he said, in the first few days, you've got such a lot of goodwill because everybody's relieved and they want change. But you've got to go, and I know this is a bad word for the Labour Party, but you've got to use that momentum to keep going. Yeah. And actually, a lot of those appointments. And I think what is often the case is that you'll see interesting appointments in the lower levels of junior ministers. I mean, the shock, surprise, the loss of Jonathan Ashworth meant that that's had to be a little bit of a reshuffle. And also Thangam Debonair, who lost her Bristol seat to the Greens, which means that Lucy Powell becomes Leader of the House and Lisa Nandy now becomes Culture Secretary, which for her is a promotion. So I think that, it's interesting, but we don't want earth-shattering. We want competence more than anything else.
He's continued with his Ming Var strategy, James, hasn't he, in terms of his cabinet, because he's not really shocked anyone with any of the appointments. The big absence is Emily Thornberry. We may come on to that, but the media were desperate for some sort of story, and I was watching the cabinet unfold in terms of the announcements, and the guy at Sky was getting very excited because he'd not seen Yvette Cooper, and almost as he said the words, "Oh, Yvette Cooper hasn't been into that," she marched down the street to be told that she was, of course, going to be Home Secretary. So, yeah, he's continued that sort of cautious approach. Jim, any standouts for you in that cabinet?
Largely speaking, it is
You'll be pleased for Lisa, won't you? Because you know Lisa and Andy well, so you'd be pleased with that appointment.
Yes, I will. I mean, she will hopefully defend the BBC from its enemies, and they have some critics, should I say? And they have some vociferous critics, Frank, as we've people who tune into this podcast will know. No, on the serious level, yeah. I mean, Lisa is sort of moved around a little bit to sort of fit awkward corners, and we'll see how she gets on. She was. I thought she was well placed in the shadow team dealing with levelling up. And then she was moved off to international affairs, which I don't think did suit her. So she's available and moved around. So let's hope she gets a good run as culture secretary, because there's a lot of issues, culture and sport, a lot of issues over the regulation of football. Is a football regulator going to be in the King's Speech? I'm told it will be, but to me, it always looks like we'll do that in the second King's Speech, but we'll see. No, I think I absolutely take Kevin's point. He was talking about stability, and that's what the country's calling for, and that's why the Ming vase had to be carried very carefully across the ballroom. It's now sitting on a table, I have to finally report, looking absolutely magnificent. Absolutely. So we've got stability, that's what he brings, and the fact that he's put into place the sort of people who were doing the job in the shadow team will give that sort of continuity. David Lammy, I still think he's slightly on probation. I mean, we're going to talk about Biden later, but I mean, it's increasingly looking as if Donald Trump will be the president of the United States next January, and the British Foreign Secretary has called him a fascist, as far as I remember. So that, could cause problems. So I think Lammy's going to have to be very, very careful what he says, and he's obviously going to have the incredibly difficult issue, and I know we're going to come on to this, of Palestine, which had done spectacular damage to Labour in some seats. They're going to have to deal with that. But I also think you've mentioned Yvette Cooper. I mean, she's got this immigration issue to deal with, and a lot of people are unconvinced by this. We'll see now about this greater cooperation with Europe. We'll see whether it actually happens. I think that problem is going to remain as intractable as ever, and ultimately, if Yvette Cooper doesn't deliver, she could have a fairly short shelf life as a cabinet minister.
Interesting. I mean, we'll come on to the Middle East issue in a moment, but you've also mentioned there, Jim, the fact that you've got people in place who, two of them you've mentioned, of the top four jobs there, who might be under a bit of pressure quite quickly. What is your view on that, Kevin? I would be really disappointed if Starmer continues with this psychodrama of reshuffles and moving cabinet ministers every 5 minutes. I'd much prefer to see people being given a fair crack of the whip. And, for me, to get to grips with some of these things, you need at least a couple of years. Giving people, we'll see how you go in 6 months and then come back to you, I think is cracking. I think, again, it's what has made our government as poor as it's been in recent times.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think he is pretty well committed to it. I mean, I think he's committed at least to 2 years, if not almost getting through the whole parliament with the same cabinet. I mean, obviously that won't happen because, events, dear boy, events will get in the way. Of course they will. A Home Office is always the hardest job to do in government. It always trips people up pretty much. And for the reasons that Jim has touched on, and others, policing and so on, and prisons, albeit in the Justice Department. A lot of issues there to deal with. I don't think Yvette Cooper is always the warmest and cuddliest character in terms of media performances. I think she'll need to be careful in the House. I think, and as a general point, I think Labour need to think very carefully about how they handle the opposition parties without being too sort of triumphalist and kicking the Tories while they're down. I think they've got to look a bit more respectful than the Tories have been to their opposition parties, and they've got to deal with Parliament in a different way, given its makeup. But so I think on purely political points, Yvette Cooper's got to be slightly careful. But as Jim says, I mean, clearly dealing with the immigration issue is significant. But of course, they can deal with the big number issue, if only in two ways. One is the legal immigration. That's really where the numbers have gone up. The numbers are not really coming from the small boat crossings, etc. Of course, that's a problem. But the numbers problem, if the headlines are all about the sort of net migration, the net migration problem is coming from the legal migration that is being allowed to happen. And as we know, that's largely a skills problem that needs correcting. And issues around universities and sort of hangers on coming into universities, etc., family members allowed or not. And secondly, and it's boring, and I think the party struggled with this in the campaign, but the boring point is you've got to process. And people are not being processed and not being processed quickly enough. Of course, there's a problem about those people who are processed, they're not given asylum, but they come from a country which is more than troublesome to send them back to. But they've got to be more efficient. They've got to just get the system, get the bodies into the Home Office, and they've got to make the system work, is the main thing. And I think there's probably a bigger debate to be had there, because what we are seeing is mass migration as a result of poverty and conflict and climate change. And therefore, there probably does need to be some new global settlement about how we deal with these great swathes of people who are moving across continents, because they're trying to get away from terrible, terrible things, man-made or otherwise, and trying to find a better lives for them and their families. I mean, who of us wouldn't do that if we were in their shoes? So I think, she's got big problems to do with. The Lammy issue, I think he's grown into that role since he's had the Foreign Affairs brief. And frankly, I think Jim's right, but who hasn't said bad things about Donald Trump? I mean, you wouldn't be able to find them, would you, and stick them in office?
I think fascist is probably one of the more complimentary comments that's been made about him. David Cameron wasn't particularly complimentary about him, Jim. So, Joe, let's just talk, before I end the first segment of the programme, about this Middle East issue that Labour clearly has a problem with. And, of course, we saw Jonathan Ashworth, who you referenced, lose his seat. We saw a couple of independent candidates, or an independent candidate was elected in Leicester. Jeremy Corbyn obviously elected, not just because of the Middle East issue, but certainly partly. And, of course, Wes Streeting's majority in one of the London constituencies slashed to hundreds rather than thousands. Is this going to still be hanging around in 5 years' time? Is it going to be something? And let's be honest. Can a UK government do that much to resolve the issue anyway?
No, but also in those results you didn't mention, Frank, George Galloway. Remember him? He won Rochdale, didn't he, on Gaza, and he has been an MP for 5 months, and he has gone back to the obscurity that he so desperately craves, to be replaced by the excellent Paul Waugh, former political editor of The Eye, who should have been the Labour candidate in the by-election. So I think, there are two things here. One is that the good side of this is that I think, however flawed our voting system is, it does show that if people coalesce around a single issue or a campaign, they can make a huge difference. Now, whether that is, that sadly has cost Jonathan Ashworth his seat, but it does mean your vote counts. And I think, above and beyond anything else, that's the most important message to people from this election. I think Gaza is a problem. It's an ongoing problem. And I think our relationship with the rest of the world will be tested, which is why I think Jim's is quite right about, I think there are lots of people who have misgivings about David Lammy, but he hasn't had a chance yet. What I wonder, and I wouldn't be surprised, is whether Keir Starmer asks David Cameron to become our ambassador to the UN or our ambassador to Washington, which would be quite a smart move. It would show him as a sort of the broad church, bringing in people who've got the expertise, got the skills, rather than jobs for a mate. And that might, smooth the path slightly with a Trump presidency. But I think the other thing is that Britain's standing in the world is so low since Brexit. Nobody really gives a monkey's what we say or what we do, because we've broken international law. We've said we're willing to break international law under Suella Braverman and Boris Johnson. And we have to, in a way, we have to rebuild our reputation to earn that respect. But having said that, what we're seeing in the rest of Europe, and I think you referenced this before, Jim, in one of our previous podcasts, that, with the Keir Starmer Labour government, Britain is a bit of an outlier, being more centre-left, as the rest of Europe seems to be heading towards the right. So all of those tensions, I think, will play out over the next few years on migration, on Gaza, on Ukraine, on our relationship with NATO, international development and funding and all of those sort of issues.
And just a final word from you, Jim, on this Middle East question. And Wes Streeting, as I say, this and somebody that you and I know well, just about to say, when I was watching the highlights back yesterday, obviously didn't expect it to be perhaps as tight as it was. Jess Phillips as well, down in Birmingham, Kevin, she had quite a rough ride over the issue. Do you think the UK can get some of its soft power back and start to play a bigger role in international affairs under a Starmer government?
Well, I think the big issue is going to be the recognition of Palestine. At one stage during the election campaign, I got the impression that Labour was going to almost do it on day one. But I watched, in the interest of being well researched for this podcast, at 1 o'clock this morning, Steve Reed on BBC Question Time saying that we'd have to do that in concert with our allies. So that's the big issue there. And I just don't think he'll appoint David Cameron to that role. I mean, I thought David Miliband would be a more likely appointment to be ambassador to the United States. Just on the Northwest scene, the seat you haven't mentioned in this connection is Blackburn, the seat of Barbara Castle and Jack Straw. Yeah. And I saw an interview with the new independent MP for Blackburn, and he was asked, I thought very astutely, what about all the other issues like housing and things like that? And he said, "Oh yes, well I'll be looking at that as well." So it is a problem for Labour. The anxiety is that, and this happened in Rochdale. Paul Wall was talking about this morning, the new MP for Rochdale, the toxicity with which people, I absolutely understand, particularly the Asian communities, the passionate feelings that they have about Gaza. But I'm afraid that in a lot of these seats, the campaign, and Jess Phillips, well, Kevin will talk more about it, the extreme toxicity with which their case is presented and the actual intimidation is very, very unfortunate, and that's the thing. So we'll have to see. I mean, pray God that the crisis will diffuse over the next couple of years. It's almost inconceivable that this level of killing and destruction can go on, and some calming of the situation may emerge. But otherwise, it's going to be quite a big problem for the British. I mean, obviously, I absolutely take Joe's point. Our role in the world has diminished, but we were the mandate power in the 1920s, the Balfour Declaration. Britain has been involved. Britain has a history in the Middle East, which, for better or worse, makes us a player, albeit a minor one.
And you were around during those times, of course, as we know, Jim, and watched it all unfold. And we do greatly appreciate your deep experience in these matters. Well, it's a big in-trade for Keir Starmer and his new Labour government. We will, of course, be watching very carefully how his first 100 days unfolds, because that's always a key milestone within any new government. But it was a disastrous night, a meltdown for the Conservative Party, a good night for the Liberal Democrats, and Reform have taken 5 seats. We'll be back after the break to talk about what next for the Tories. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Joined this week by our man in the West Midlands, Kevin Johnson, Joe Phillips, of course, the former advisor to Paddy Ashdown, and Downtown's political commentator, Jim Hancock. So a fabulous night for the Labour Party on Thursday, but not so good for Rishi Sunak and his Conservatives. Now, the last 5 years, they've not covered themselves in glory. The campaign, to me, sort of mirrored what we'd gone through during those past 5 years. It was chaotic from its launch in Downing Street in the pissing down rain without a brolly, through to his D-Day disaster, then his Sky TV faux pas. I mean, even going into the last couple of days of the campaign, some of the Tories jumping on this comment that Keir Starmer had made that he'd quite like to spend a couple of hours on a Friday evening with his kids and trying to pretend that somehow he was going to be a part-time Prime Minister. They'd be really surprised this morning, won't they, to see him calling a Saturday morning cabinet meeting. Not sure Boris Johnson ever did that. But Joe, it was a disastrous campaign, wasn't it? From start to finish. And they never shifted the dial, which of course would have been Sunak's hope at all. If anything, I think they may have lost support, particularly, and we'll come on to the Lib Dems, but particularly in those sort of blue wall seats.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the damage was done and will remain for many, many years with Partygate. And, you know, every single Tory MP who has lost their seat needs to reflect on that, you know, in the desire for charisma and winnability and all of that. You know, we talk about Keir Starmer being boring, but, you know, give me boring anytime over somebody like Boris Johnson. You know, and we've seen that absolute pantomime of revolving doors of minister after minister. You know, we've had more housing ministers in the last 5 years than we've had housing policies. So how can you ever have stability? How can you ever plan, whether you're in business or local government or in the health service? You can't do that with that chaotic government. And then, of course, we had Liz Truss, who so sadly lost her seat, although she probably doesn't realise. You know, so we've had all of that. And so in a way, Rishi Sunak got a bad hand. You know, the Tory members didn't want him as leader. He was elected by MPs in the end in disaster. What the Tory party has to do now is to decide whether it goes back to the centre or whether it follows endlessly to Reform, who of course have now got 5 MPs. I mean, I thought there were some interesting comments from people losing their seats. Robert Buckland, who was the former Justice Secretary, who launched a blistering attack on his former colleagues for their performances, their desperate seeking of headlines, their ill thought out policy announcements. I mean, you know, maybe he was thinking of Suella Braverman, maybe he was thinking of Boris Johnson. He didn't name them, but it was absolutely blistering. And, you know, the other people like Bill Wiggins in Herefordshire, who lost his seat to the Greens, again, talking about how we need to go back, or they, the Conservative Party, need to go back to being that sort of one nation Tory. But, you know, we're going to have yet more psychodrama because Penny Mordaunt's lost her seat. So she's obviously out of the running for leadership. So the battle's on. Is it Suella Braverman against Kemi Badenoch, or who else is there? I mean, they need to sort themselves out because they won't be taken seriously as an opposition all the time they're fighting like cats in a sack.
Yeah, it was a devastating night for a lot of cabinet ministers who lost their seats. Jeremy Hunt, interestingly, held on. And the person that we didn't see at all during the campaign certainly didn't have any sort of profile, and I think has kept her powder dry for months now. Priti Patel. Wouldn't be surprised to see her emerge as a leadership candidate. Never fell out with the Boris gang. As I say, it's not really been one of those people wielding the knife whilst Rishi Sunak has been in charge, the way Braverman has. And Badenoch, I think, has shifted those positions, between those positions. She's never struck me as being 100% Sunak, but never been quite as vociferous in her criticism as Braverman has been. But as I always say, you can't be a little bit pregnant. So she's neither one thing or the other, really. So, Jim, what do you think, Tory party? And again, coming back to the Northwest, absolutely blown away. The Red Wall has returned. Esther McVeigh hung on by just over about 1,000 votes. Southport has gone Labour for the first time ever. And some incredible results in the north of England, actually, for the Tories.
Absolutely. I was quite pleased also that Giles Brandreth's daughter won in Chester South and Eddisbury. I did the hustings for them, and I was quite impressed with her. But you know, when you think about the magnitude of this, from Macclesfield, Ribble Valley, and Nigel Evans, the deputy speaker.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Speaker.
And as you probably know, I'm originally from the southwest, and for Cornwall to see a complete Tory wipeout, Liberal Democrats making the sort of gains you'd expect, but Labour with 3 seats in Cornwall, including southeast Cornwall, which is where my grandparents were brought up, you know, the village of Corsand and Liscard, having a Labour MP, absolutely inconceivable. But perhaps we should just move the thing on a minute. I think it's crucial now, from the Conservative Party's point of view, that they do not plunge into a leadership election this summer. I think if I was advising them, I would keep. It's very difficult for Rishi Sunak, I understand that, but I think he needs to stay in place. My parallel is not with 1906, where, you know, I was a young man, of course, in those days, but a little bit later, in 1979-80, when Jim Callaghan actually stayed on for about 15 months to allow the Labour Party to settle down after its defeat. I mean, it chose Michael Foot, which we can not debate it today whether it actually made a difference. But I'm just saying that, you know, a party that rushes into a new leader now, I think they did it with William Hague, who was then a right-wing, quite divisive figure, and that was a mistake. And then there was another mistake with Ian Duncan Smith, and by the way, another great, incredible survivor of the thing. And then Michael Howard, and then it took a long time to get David Cameron. So I think Rishi Sunak should stay and preside over the debate. And the last thing I'd just say, I've just put one other name into the hat, which is James Cleverly. I hear him mentioned this morning in circles as a possible contender to bring the party together.
I think a lot of people are urging Rishi Sunak to hang around, Kevin. He's not going to have an appetite to, though, is he? I mean, he's got his tickets booked to the States. He's wanting to go off and be a tech bro. His wife looked as though she was dancing down Downing Street, never mind, you know, walking down it when they, after his resignation speech. He's been absolutely battered in the job. He's not leaving office, I don't sense, with even the sympathy that incumbents usually, you know, you usually see on those Downing Street steps, Thatcher, Major, Gordon Brown, you know, there is a degree of sympathy, isn't there, for the outgoing Prime Minister? There was none of that. So he's got a party that hate him. He's got a country that certainly didn't fall in love with him. And now people are saying to him, come on, Rishi, hang on into this job that's a thankless task for a few months, when actually you could be in California on the beach with a glass of something sparkling. Is he going to hang around, Kevin?
Well, the first thing we should just point out is that, to be fair to her, his wife did have an umbrella standing by for him yesterday. If only that were the case.
You can see who's got the bloody brains in that house, can't you?
Exactly. That come from an IT family for nothing, you know. I think Jim is right in what should happen. What will happen is it could be quite different, but and whether it could last 15 months is quite another thing. But I think the broad thrust of Jim's argument is right, because you know, two things really. One is it's incredibly important to have good opposition for all the delight that we might have that we got some, you know, idea of competence potentially taking power. You need an opposition to keep you true and to interrogate and to scrutinise and all of that. So it's important that there's a Conservative Party, as well as the other parties, with more people on various other benches now in Parliament. So it's important. And secondly, I don't know what lessons they're going to take from this party, because the kind of people you've just talked about, Frank, that they take they might as well be in different parties. If most of the lessons I'm hearing from some of these characters is we've got to go more right, we've got to be even harder on tax, even harder on borders, even harder on more people up in prison, whatever. Oh no, we seem to have been bursting our prisons already. That's one take, and there's another take which might come back more to the One Nation or to the Cameroons or whatever. I mean, what are they going to settle around, and how are they going to handle? Do we absorb Farage, or do we, you know, try and, you know, boot him off even further off to the right? I think it's going to take them a long time in policy and political terms, never mind in sort of personal and psychological terms, to come to terms with what has happened to them, not just in this election, but over the course of the last 14 years and the whole, you know, journey we've been through, from austerity through Brexit, through COVID, through Ukraine and everything else that has gone on. So I do think they need longer in opposition and, you know, to sort out their leadership. I actually think, although you're right, Frank, I'm sure he wants to be elsewhere, he might do a better job of being leader of the opposition than being Prime Minister. Yeah. And, you know, I thought in that last debate, the BBC debate, with Michelle Hussein, you could see the kind of anger. I mean, he was getting his lines in. I thought he was too aggressive and talking over people, both Starmer and Michelle Hussein. But you could see he got his lines. He was banging away. He was quite passionate about it, about tax and pensions and borders and all the rest of it. You can see him organising a bit of an effective opposition, getting opposition spokesmen to do their job, to do their research, to find out, where can you find holes in their opposite number. He might make a decent fist of it, just in organisational terms for 6 months. So I think they've got to take a while, and also we don't really know, 120, 121 of them. I mean, who's left and who are the new people coming in and where are they on the sort of political spectrum? I mean, if you're trying to run a leadership campaign, Grant Shapps and his famous spreadsheets, he'll have a bit more time to do those now. Where are you going to put them in the spreadsheet? Because, you've got new people coming in. So if they rush into it, I think that will do them no good at all.
You see,
whether rush you can stay is quite another matter.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, there will be some pressure. Oh, we must have somebody in place for the Conservative Party conference. But I think they've just got to, take. I think it's in Birmingham, isn't it, Kevin? I think the conference.
I think you might be right. Yeah.
It's just going to have to be
that's going to be a fun day, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I'll never forget, actually, I went to the Conservative conference in Blackpool in October 1979. And I don't know if you know the Horseshoe, where all the displays and exhibits usually used to be in those days. And all there was a white curtain to carve it off so that nobody went there, because no sponsors wanted to go there. So that you're right there, Frank. It will be a bit of a wake. But I just, I don't think there should be pressure to have a new leader for the Conservative Party conference. I think that should be a time of calm reflection under Rishi Sunak. I agree with Kevin. I'm saying 18 months, that's a long time. But
isn't the problem going to be, though, the membership of the Conservative Party that does want to become reform, that does think that Nigel Farage is a great political leader?
Yeah, but there's
actually... No, let me finish, sorry, Jim. That, we had a situation where the membership elected Johnson, it then elected Truss, never elected Sunak, didn't elect Theresa May, let's not forget. So if the Conservative Party, almost no matter what it does, can wait 6 months, it can make 12 months, unless it changes the way it selects leaders, or unless you have a cohort of MPs, and who knows, new faces, new people, new personalities, that comes in and works its system so they put two, if I can put it this way, sensible people in the final ballot. But then wouldn't they have an absolute car crash in terms of its members then screaming and shouting, you're not giving us the choice that we want? Joe, it's
Can I just say, Frank, I just want to say there is a lively debate. I've already heard it starting to stop the system of letting the members choose and revert to. I've heard it, 2 or 3 people overnight from the Conservative Party saying we are a parliamentary democracy. The Parliamentary Conservative Party should choose the leader, and precisely because of the Johnson and Truss mistakes. Now, this is going to cause a huge turmoil in the rank and file of the Conservative Party. But this debate is going on. Sorry.
Yeah, but that's but the problem you've got, Jim, is look at what you're asking for. You're asking for Rishi Sunak to stay on for about 3 years while they sort out their internal machinations of how you elect a new leader. Because that's not something. No, but I know, but it's I think fanciful to believe that you can have this juggernaut of a new government. You've got Farage then, who is going to take a massive amount of media space and oxygen from them, no doubt helped by your mate at the BBC. And you've got a new, I guess, re-energised Liberal Democrat Party. So the Tories are not going to want to sit back, are they, and reflect. They will want to say, let's get our new person in quickly. And actually, it should be, red meat to the members. That's what they want, Jim.
I think
that's what the members want.
Yes, I mean, I think 2 things. One is that Jim is quite right. You go to the Tory party conference this autumn, and it will be like walking around a closing down sale where there's nothing left except coat hangers. Nobody's going to want to be there. They're not going to get the media exposure anymore. And what will happen is that donations will just, fall away. Membership has probably already fallen away, and the people who are the sort of the foot soldiers in constituencies, they're not going to go out campaigning. They've probably had enough abuse thrown at them over the last few weeks. Whereas Reform, of course, they're well funded by various donors, and they will attract new members, which means that they therefore will probably have a better organisation, probably of pretty unpleasant people, but as a party they will have the organisational capability that I think the Tories will lose. And it may well be that a lot of Tories join Reform, in which case you're then left with a Tory party that could be a sensible Tory party, but that is, 18 months, 2 years down the road. I mean, they've got to work really hard to get trust back. And trust, not trust. And I think, what Keir Starmer said when he went into Downing Street, yesterday, was this thing about trust. And it's not just trust in the Labour Party or government, it's trust in our political system, which is so broken. And it has been so trashed by the Conservative Party. But, if the alternative is Reform, then we need a Conservative Party, but it's got to be one that's sensible.
Listen, I want to mention the Liberal Democrats and their tremendous performance before we move on to things abroad and what's happening in the States. We'll talk about Reform and other things on Monday, if that's okay, because I'm conscious of the time. Joe, you've said throughout this campaign the Liberal Democrats had targeted resources. Kevin referenced it in the first part of the programme. Very effective, very efficient. And Ed Davey, well, people may have been laughing at him as he jumped off the side of piers and took to bungee jumping and fell into the Lake District, shitty seas and all that sort of stuff. But it worked, didn't it? It got him the sort of coverage and profile he wanted. Yeah,
it worked. It got him huge coverage that he wouldn't have got otherwise by going out and making a speech. You could look at it and think, well, how undignified, how stupid, how ridiculous. He looked human. He looked like he was enjoying it. And actually, that plays in slightly to the conversation we're going to have about America. People like people who have got energy and look like they've got the ability to do things. So Ed, who is, he's a lovely person, as Jim and I both know, but he's not seen as somebody who's sort of hyperactive. What I find astonishing, and this is going to sound terribly rude, but for all the activities he's done over the last 6 weeks, he does look like he's put on an extra few pounds. So I think maybe he'll need to go on a diet, but they have done well, because for every daft picture that they've had, they've managed to stick on those two clear issues, social care and sewage, and nobody else was talking about them. And I think Ed Davey has come across as human. I think Daisy Cooper, the deputy leader, has been really good in the dreadful TV debates, and I hope that is the end of that for the next election campaign. And they are now significant and getting to 71, possibly 72 by the end of today seats. That means that you get an automatic question at Prime Minister's question time. It means you've got more MPs who can sit on select committees. It means you've got more influence. And it means that not just half a dozen of you are trying to hold the ground at Westminster and deal with constituency work. So that, in terms of organisation, it's massive, absolutely massive. And it goes back to what we were saying. It means they'll recruit members, and it means they'll recruit new councillors. And that in turn changes everything.
Frank, can I ask Joe a question?
Yeah.
Joe, I mean, and we talked about this before on a podcast. I never believed the Lib Dems would get back to this because they didn't have a thing, but they have kind of, as you say, the couple of issues you touched on, the founder thing, plus Davis' performance and, the targeting and the kind of the landscape they were working in. But I never thought they'd also get back to the kind of halcyon days, Charles Kennedy, and of course, Paddy Ashdown. And they've got above those numbers. I mean, incredibly, got above the numbers Paddy and Charles have. A question for you then, Joe, is what would Paddy make of it if we were around now?
He'd have been out there going down a slide, but probably with a knife in his mouth. he used to come on stage at Liberal Democrat conferences, and he'd always joke saying, "As far as I know, I am the only trained killer in Parliament." Oh, he'd be absolutely thrilled. And actually, talking of grandees, it was very moving to see Neil Kinnock with Keir Starmer.
Yeah. And Joe, I know that you don't particularly rate our electoral system, but it's 62, not 72 MPs that the Liberal Democrats have won, isn't it?
No, I think Joe's right.
No,
72.
71, and they'll get Inverness today.
71.
We're waiting for one from
That's
Scotland.
even better than I had them in the 60s for some reason. Wow. Well, that is an
that was
impressive
because
performance.
The exit poll forecast.
Yeah,
they've
done far better than expected. Far
Yeah,
better.
the exit poll forecast also gave Reform 13.
Yeah.
So
we should talk about the Greens just briefly, though, Frank, because I think they also.
We will, Joe, but we'll do that on Monday because
just my reflection.
No, Jim, no, we'll come back to it on Monday because I'm conscious. Look, we've got the Greens, we've got the SNP meltdown, you've got Farage and his crowd, and you've got some interesting independents in Parliament as well, and 72 Liberal Democrats. I do apologise, but I want to just spend 5 minutes on what's happening in the United States, because I think that whatever we say about Labour government and what it's going to do and things like the Middle East and Ukraine, what's happening across the pond is going to impact on those key issues far more than what Keir Starmer and the Labour government does. Kevin, I know you're a keen watcher of television debates. I've not seen any performance worse than Biden's 10 days ago or so now, wasn't it? He's hanging on in there, though, Kevin. Is it sustainable, his candidacy?
No. I mean, the short answer is no, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't look like it's going anywhere. And he's been pretty bold in saying such things, both publicly and privately, to Democrats in the last few days. But it really cannot last, can it? And I know people have said it'll be unfair to land all the responsibility onto Jill Biden or onto Obama or any other sort of grandees. But I mean, they have got to get him to move, haven't they? Because we all know, I mean, as much as we absolutely hate it, and Joe Biden is a good man, and he's doing incredible things. I mean, he is not getting the rewards from the work he's done, particularly in terms of the economics and the Inflation Reduction Act and so on, and the impact that's had. But it's not coming through. And he looks, I mean, people should be able to do what they like at any age, to any age. And if they've still got the ability, they should do it. And probably in many ways, he does have the ability. But, as we know, as we talked about this election on this side of the pond, the performance matters. Your authority and your presence does matter, particularly in that role above all other political roles in the world. And it can't last. And we know that Trump, even with things as they were, and it's got worse, Trump is looking like he's heading to a victory. And the horror for me is that however bad Trump was the first time around, two things were in our favour, if you like, or the favour of sanity. One was he had COVID to deal with. I'm not saying he dealt with it greatly, but that got in the way of doing much else for a large part of the term. And secondly, he had some sensible people around him. In the next Trump presidency, if he gets there, he's not going to have the sensible people around him. He's full Trump next time. He's not sort of managed Trump by a few Republican, in-houses. So it's imperative, absolutely imperative for the world, I think, without being too sort of bold about it. It's imperative for the world that sense comes to prevail and they rally around a new candidate. And I know there are questions about whether Kamala Harris could beat him or some of the other characters around, but it cannot last. But at the moment, it doesn't look like he's going anywhere.
Full fat Trump, that's a frightening thing. And of course, the Supreme Court ruled last week that he's basically got anything he wants to do. So no, it is frightening. His interview last night with George Stephanopoulos, I watched some of that, and he didn't do himself any harm, Joe, but he didn't come across as being somebody you'd say, oh, okay, that was just a bad night at the office, the debate. He didn't do enough to turn it round, I don't think.
No, he's making it worse. I mean, we heard him say, oh, yeah, I screwed up and it was because of jet lag and I was tired. Well, that was after
that's the job.
And it was after he's had a week's rest. And last night he said, only the Lord can stop me doing this. And it is, I know I've said it before, but it's sort of like we've got to take the car keys away from him because he's actually going to crash America. And unless, and Jim said this on our previous podcast, in this country, men and women in grey suits would go around and say it's time to go. But that doesn't happen in America. And they've got to, for the sake of the world, they've got to get somebody else in who can take on Trump.
Jim, final word to you on the American situation.
Yes, the interview last night, there's always this sort of, you think this is the last straw that will break the camel's back. I said on the last podcast that the opinion polls would probably do it. Well, the opinion polls have widened the gap, but it hasn't done it. Then there's this interview last night, and as Joe says, he actually said, I want to say God to remove me. So he's absolutely hunkered down. The technical problems are that, as I understand it, that all the funding that's gone behind Biden is also only committed also to Kamala Harris, but as Kevin said, she's not everybody's cup of tea. So there are real problems here. I think the only solution, which won't necessarily guarantee a Democrat victory, is for the convention to choose a new candidate, and it probably should be Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. But that's by no means clear. And you've said, Frank, the frightening thing is that the Supreme Court have now empowered Donald Trump. I mean, I heard some discussions about how that would have applied to Nixon and things like that. And Nixon would have been absolutely in the clear with Watergate under these powers.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. Well, still, the election's out the way, but still much to talk about in the world of politics, isn't there always? We haven't even mentioned the French election. Round 2, of course, happens tomorrow. National rally facing up against mostly socialists, but also some of Macron's people have managed to stay in that second round. So on Monday, we'll be back. We'll be talking about the French election. We'll talk about some of those other parties that have been elected to our parliament that we've not managed to get round to today. And perhaps we'll be celebrating Gareth Southgate's Mingvar strategy. Quarter-final today against Switzerland, and he'll be looking at Kia thinking, well, if he can get there like that, surely we can get to the final. Good luck, Gareth and the boys, and we'll see you all again on Monday. Have a great weekend, everyone, and thanks, Kevin, thanks, Joe, thanks, Jim, for joining me today.